Well, I think that Europe, the European Union and the member states and this parliament have to accept the reality on the ground that former President Morsi has been deposed. I prefer the term military intervention to coup, because coup would suggest just the armed forces acting unilaterally, top-down, undemocratically, without responding to the wishes of the people. It's very clear, if you followed events in the last week or two, there was a massive popular uprising against the government. I mean, figures range between 10 and 20 million people out on the streets. The so-called couch carriers, people what we would call the silent majority, came out literally carrying a couch or a seat to protest to protest the fact that normally they weren't even taken into consideration. On this occasion they were just fed up. And I think that you have to see a very complex situation which risked serious deterioration in terms of bloodshed and possibly even civil war. And I think that the army felt it had a duty to preserve law and order. President Morsi had repeatedly refused to engage in dialogue with the increasingly strident opposition, who were fed up with the inept way he had been running the economy, were deeply angered by the way, having won the election with a very narrow majority of 51%, had decided to arrogate all the levers of power and to try and turn Egypt into a one-party Muslim Brotherhood, Sharia-based state. And Egypt is a very complex society. You have a very large secular component. You have 7 or 8 million Christians, the Copts, who are united in their desire to have the right to peacefully practice their religion and not have their churches attacked or their priests murdered and so on. And it was clear that the Muslim Brotherhood wished to turn Egypt into a kind of Sunni Islamic Republic, and there was very little support for that other than from his own immediate followers. And I think people had given him the benefit of the doubt who were not keen on a religious state in the election. But as soon as he came to power, many people felt betrayed by Morsi in the way he decided to pursue a very narrow sectarian agenda, which to those of us like myself who have studied the origins of the Muslim Brotherhood, the writings of Qutb and people like that, it does have an agenda basically along very strict fundamentalist lines. So why people were surprised by that, I don't know. And he had already behaved in a fairly arrogant fashion when he basically tried to create a series of decrees giving him impunity from the law, which he had to retract under international pressure 6 months ago. So I'm not at all surprised that he proved to be who he was. I'm very sorry that the attempts at a democratic election and having a democratically elected government have failed. I'm hopeful that, and I believe the intentions of the army are to stay there for as little time as possible, to rewrite the constitution in a more inclusive way, to accommodate the rights of women, the rights of other religious minorities, particularly the Christians, who are a very large minority. And I hope they'll have very early presidential and parliamentary elections, and we can get back onto the democratic track as soon as possible.
What happens if at the next elections the army doesn't like the result?
Well, you have to ask the army that. I can't speak for the Egyptian armed forces, but I mean, obviously, if there are more safeguards built into the constitution, then it should not be possible for a president, particularly one winning on such a narrow majority, to, as it were, disregard all the rights of minority and women and LGBT rights, these sort of things. He would, if you have a more inclusive agenda, within the constitution, to, as it were, ensure democracy and fundamental human rights, irrespective of the party of government, that presumably will avoid a repeat of where we are now.
What should Europe do and what can Europe do?
Well, it's a very difficult question, and we're all thinking about this. It is a worry that, for instance, yesterday we had a debate in the Foreign Affairs Committee actually with a leading member of the European Court of Auditors. Europe has thrown a lot of money at Egypt, something like €1 billion in the last 7 years, and there's a prospect of another billion, of which 40 million have been spent this year. And the money, according to the Court of Auditors, has been largely wasted. And so it's a very pressing question to our taxpayers. What I would fear is a collapse of the economy. There is very little foreign direct investment now because, for obvious reasons, people are scared of law and order, security, the risk of civil war and so on. There's almost no tourism for the same kind of reasons. A lot of money has been given to Egypt from the Arab Sunni world and from Turkey in aid. But obviously the economy is struggling. So we need to create jobs. There's a very large number of unemployed young people, particularly young men who are angry and out on the streets. It has to be stabilized. It's a very big country, 90 odd million people. If that country were to totally destabilize, you'd have a huge refugee crisis, literally millions of people, particularly the Christians, who would feel very vulnerable indeed, heading towards Europe. Enormous pressure on our resources, our public services. So we have a sort of enlightened self-interest to stabilize Egypt.
You mentioned Turkey. Turkey's on the border of Europe, almost a member. What are the lessons to be learnt there?
Well, that's an interesting point. I mean, of course, the Turkish ruling party, Justice and Development, AKP, of Erdogan, is a sister party of the Muslim Brotherhood. They had very close links. Erdogan was very supportive of Morsi. And I think he is obviously very angry by this turn of events. We've seen similar tensions in Turkey, not as perhaps not as widespread, but certainly, a few weeks ago there were some very, widespread protests, in Istanbul and other major cities, but not literally millions. I mean, I don't think the numbers were as big, but a similar kind of tension between those who want a more westward-leaning, progressive, modern Turkey, secular, and those who want a more pious, religious, Islamic Sunni Turkey, and that sort of type of fracture was also very evident in Egypt. But the army are more respectful, in Turkey of the ability of Erdogan, who is very economically competent. Yeah. The Turkish economy has been growing, jobs have been created, and that is the difference. I think that had Morsi been economically competent, some of these other problems might have been containable, but because he was both incompetent economically and also trying to arrogate powers, bring powers to his party and make sure that it would become eventually a one-party state, the Egyptian people wouldn't have any of it and rose up, basically.
The one true democratic state in the Middle East, Israel, must be looking at these events with trepidation.
Sure, I think Israel is very, very worried about all of this. They want stability in their neighborhood. They have a peace agreement, Camp David, with Egypt. I haven't spoken to my Israeli counterparts and colleagues since the fall of President Morsi. They're equally worried about what's going on in Syria. They've got instability now in Egypt, Syria, the worry about stability in Jordan and in Lebanon. It's very, very worrying for Israel. Israel has tried to have some rapprochement with Turkey, after the problems a year ago with the naval flotilla and trying to break the embargo. I don't think that's been particularly successful, sadly. And so Israel has very, very few friends surrounding it. And I think probably, grosso modo, as it were, probably the return of the army, at least short term, will be slightly reassuring to Israel, because I think Israel would have been even more worried by a civil war breaking out, which would have also impacted on the Sinai and people moving across their borders. And also they would have been worried about an increasingly strident Muslim Brotherhood one-party state with a very strong Islamist agenda, particularly if it then made links with Iran, which we had seen in the past over Hamas. Hamas, again, a Muslim Brotherhood offshoot, was getting money from both Sunni Islamists as well as Shia extremists, i.e. Iran was funding it, but also some of the Qataris, Saudis and so on. So a tricky one. And so I think Israel's probably on balance relieved, but Israel would prefer to have a stable, liberal, democratic society in Egypt, in Syria and all its neighbors. But that's probably not going to happen for the foreseeable future.
Finally, if I may, Charles, is the Middle East a slightly safer place this week than it was last week?
That's a very good question. Is it a safer place? Certainly, if the worst scenario had happened and civil war broken out in Egypt, I think that's certainly true. Obviously, as we speak, there are bulletins coming through of protesters, being killed, people being arrested in Egypt, people, as it were, being rounded up by the army. It's very early days in this so-called revolution. I think it's always better to answer these questions a month or two and see after the dust has settled. They were very early days, but I do know that certainly here in the European Union and Parliament, we will try and do whatever we can to try and help stabilize and bring democracy and human rights back to that country as soon as possible. And we just hope that the army don't stay too long, because generally speaking, military regimes, even in these kind of extremist situations, they don't produce the kind of prosperity, stability and democracy which we wish for the people of Egypt.